Had a couple of people ask me about some of the issues related to registering the sprockets. One was a question about how to do 8mm, and the other one was some of the issues related to when it got off track. So I want to go through the entire process, and I also want to show how I actually do my scanning. I think my registration is pretty good, um, but I do post-process. But I want to show that the actual registration itself, before even I come to the point of processing, is not really bad, especially on good film. What you can see here is a clip of some Hawaii 8mm. It was taken in the 70s. It's Kodachrome. And, well, that's started in the wrong space. Hang on. Let's do the... No, this is the right one. Okay, you see when they get blown out at the sprockets, you get a little bit of movement. It's not huge, but there is some movement, and that's the sort of thing that I'm actually looking to correct. When the film is actually quite dark, there's really not a lot of movement at all when the film is really good. But of course, you know, I do believe that these film, when the film actually came, it came double-sided or something like that, or reversing, and you used to flip the reel or something like that. I'm not entirely certain, and that's why you get a lot of this blowout. And that can cause some movement. It's not huge, but there is some, and that's what I'm looking to correct. Firstly, though, I do want to go through and show I never scan uncompressed. I never scan compressed. I always scan uncompressed. I have the 2K scanner. And I always export as a TIFF because TIFF is required to come into the image sequence in DaVinci. And I've started to scan at the 4:3 large 2K file or 2K image, just because it gives me a little bit of movement to correct. A little bit of room to correct any movement. Okay, so there are my files, and now I'm going to export. I'm going to just do one file to start. We'll just do the first Hawaii film because it's actually not very much. It's only 25 foot. And export. And it is as simple as I go through, obviously, and I change everything to image. I don't think you can do this in bulk. So bear with me. I'll speed this up, actually. Oh, that's another thing. My previous video where I actually I did the registration, it looked incredibly quick, and it looked quick because I'd sped it up. And export now. Oh, didn't I just check that? All right, so that's done. That was about 5 minutes, and for the record, I think to do any sort of uncompressed, you actually have to have a SCSI setup or a solid state, and I have a solid state drive. And here we are. This is my Hawaii film. Let's see. This is, like I said, this is 25 foot. Oh, it's really it's playing up today just because I'm using Camtasia in the background. So that 25 foot is 15 gigabytes, or a little over. If we want to have a look, I'll show you what the images themselves look like. And let's just choose a random one. All right, and here we go. What I'm looking to do is actually clip out this box here. Roughly represents about a 1080. So once I've actually done the straightening, you know, I can pretty much clip my box to about that. Now, it looks a little bit overblown, actually. That looks a little bit hotter than I want. Probably going to go back there and play with the settings a little bit. I did scan the first batch a little bit hotter than I normally would. Okay, but for the purpose of this tutorial, it'll serve quite well. Open up Resolve. I don't know how well I'm going to be able to use Resolve with having Camtasia running as well. So let's just see. Yeah, it's taking forever to load. I don't have a particularly slow machine, but I built it back in, I think it was about 2014. So it's not exactly brand new by any means. Oh, everything's on the wrong screen. I got a dual screen setup, so that's why I'm having to bring everything over. And I'm also going to copy my Hawaii footage to a local drive. I don't do anything in DaVinci that isn't on my solid state. Okay, go back, change your project settings to make sure it's the full aperture, because we want to see all the way to the sprocket. Sorry, we want to see all the way to the sprockets. Oh, shit, forget it. Change the full aperture because it matches our settings currently. I don't know if the playback rate needs to be changed or anything like that, and I don't change any of the video monitoring. So save that. Add our Hawaii footage, and now we can add our Hawaii footage to our timeline. And I'll play it so you can actually see what it looks like. Now there's not a lot of movement, but there is movement. And what I'm trying to do is get rid of it. Now you could make the argument that there's probably more movement in the camera, which there is. So if you just, crop it like this, who's going to know? And no one's going to know, to be honest. I mean, you could crop it at this, lose 20 pixels either side, and no one would ever notice. This is just me being being anally retentive, really. The reason the playback's as bad as it is just because I think it's rendering on the fly. Let me go into here. Yeah, it's shown it as 30 frames because I have to correct the speed later, remember? Okay, so I want to make it as straight as possible, and there are a few different techniques that you can use. Sprockets is one that I always do. I always go for the sprockets, make sure that the sprockets, the big opening, do the tracking, and everything should line up. Now, if you notice, there is variability around the sprockets with, just the way they've been cut out. So even though it's pretty straight, and it's much, much straighter than it is here, it's not always 100%. You can get it so that there is almost no movement at all in your image from image. And generally what you do is you'll find somewhere like in the top corner here, which is a black area. And because that never changes, that little dimple that comes out there will never change as long as this film goes along. It's the same with these. They'll never change. You can actually track these. And if you track these, your frames will line up almost identical every time. I think it's a little bit more difficult in terms of processing, but just so that you know, these will never, never, never move. All right, so the processing, back to the Fusion. Fusion, when it wants to open, that is. Okay, my techniques for doing 8mm. Well, all right, first thing we have to do is we have to add our tracking tool. So there's our planar tracker. Now again, like I say, we could just do this line here. I could actually draw a box around this, and it would just look for these little things here, these very sharp contrast areas. The one problem with this, of course, is if the screen goes black. Because if the screen goes black, you lose everything. Now, I can go along my entire piece of film and see that that doesn't happen. So I could do those if I wanted to. Now, there are multiple ways to draw. I generally stick to just the sprockets. I do an outline. And again, this is just quick and rough. I mean, I could just do the bottom sprocket if I wanted to. How you want to do this is completely up to you. But what I try and do is make sure that it matches the full length of the frame. Across here. As little of this as possible. Because remember, you don't want to... you're not trying to track these areas. They're not important. But you do want to track the rest of the frame. So I straighten this up. I don't know if it makes a huge amount of difference, but I do it. It might be just an OCD thing. And I could go through and, like I say, smooth these, make these a little bit more rounded. Now, the other thing is sometimes I will draw out to here and do this. And I don't know if this makes a whole lot of difference or makes no difference or whatever else. And I'll actually draw around and give you this sort of a shape. Again, not sure if it makes a whole hell of a lot of difference. But I do, once you do register it, this frame can move, and sometimes it'll move outside so that it'll align, but it's actually aligned outside of the current frame. It's just a nature of the tool, and obviously we don't want that to happen. We want this to straighten, and everything in this frame to straighten within this frame. That just is some trial and error, and again, I don't really... right now it's a little bit of a black box to me. I know it works and I know how to make it work, but I'm not entirely sure what it does. Okay, so we change it to translation, make it point area, and start tracking. Oh, hang on a second. Set, start tracking. Yeah, I don't know what was happening there other than I think DaVinci is a massive resource hog, and I also have a problem about keeping multiple windows open. This is a little section that I've actually just tracked. If we move along the timeline here, it's not greatest because I've actually tracked it to this sprocket. You have to do more than that. There's still some movement in there because there's variation around the sprocket. Like I say, these areas here would be better. They would have less movement, and as long as they don't go out of frame, they're fairly useful. So let's go back and we'll remove the existing points. Again, I like to draw a box in my 8mm. Actually, let's find a nice dark area. An area that yeah, there we go, that's a bit better. That goes something like this. Actually, I like to take it so that I get that little bit of that curvature in here. And I like to make sure that it's the extent, the length of the frame. So top of the frame, bottom of the frame. And up here. Again, you can be more particular if you want. And you cut this. If your area was black in here, you could just make this one big long rectangle. But I don't want it tracking any of this information in here. So I'll try and keep this as thin as possible. Set and track. Oh, change it to area, translation, and track. Again, DaVinci is an enormous resource hog, so this is going to take ages. Alright, that's enough. I don't really want to do too much. I'm just more about showing you the process. So stop. And we go back and we steady it. And we shouldn't see an awful lot of movement. There wasn't a lot of movement in this frame to begin with. So let's see. And we'll play. I'm not even sure that this is a greatly corrected image because I still have movement. My sprockets were already fairly good, so you've got to be careful that you don't want to introduce movement that isn't there, if you understand what I'm saying. You don't want to be actually having steady film and then introducing error. Alright, we're into a section now where I can see it's moving. Yeah, it is steadier though. If you actually look at this, it is steadier. Because, the frame just naturally wobbles, I think. Right. There's another way that you can actually go about doing it instead of using the sprocket holes. The sprocket holes are quick and they're easy, but they're not perfect. Using features like this is much, much better. So let's try one of those. I'm going to remove my existing points. I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit. Whoops. I must have got a spline. And we're just going to track that little area there. And let's move this back into frame. Fit it. Alright, so instead of doing the sprocket holes, let's see if these yield any better results. And again, you're going to have to play with this. Set it, area, translation, and go. See, and now it's going to match all of that, those fixed points that we know that are in the actual frame itself, rather than the cut sprocket holes. Okay, I'm going to stop that. And we're going to go back and steady. And again, this is the whole thing's not steady, just this section here. And you'll see if there's much movement. Oh, it's been a resource hog again. I really need to get a faster computer. Okay, and let's just see what it's like. See, that's bang on. That doesn't move at all. Now, but you can see that there is some movement in the film. Oh, come on, behave. It's got to render, that's the problem. You see there's all that movement at the edge there, but there's no movement in those points. So that's another way of go about actually stabilizing your film. You don't necessarily have to go to the sprockets. You can choose something like this, which is a known feature. You know this isn't going to change throughout the frames, and the registration's even better. And again, you could probably argue that there's more movement in the camera operator, and it's pointless, and all those other good things. And I'd be hard pressed to have an argument that would support my position, because I'm just doing this really because I want the best copy that I can take into editing. Let's go back, you know that it's rendered, and have a look at it. And if you look at that, there is no movement in that frame. It has corrected that error. Okay, and so ends my tutorial on how to track and fix any shakiness in your 8mm film. Again, 8mm, especially 8mm like this, there's not going to be an awful lot of movement, but there is going to be some movement. I've made sure that I'm actually at the maximum resolution that I can scan at, and if I come back later on and I can clip this and make a pretty much perfect 1080 copy. Oh, one more thing I forgot to mention. Actually, I had a question from Steve Compton. I should state, I didn't say earlier, but this is actually a film that's available on YouTube, but it's been produced for the Movie Stuff RetroScan Universal Users Group that's on Facebook. There'll be a link in the description for the video. It's also being posted on my business website, which is Lighthouse Archiving and Scanning Services. Anyway, the question that Steve proposed is he was interested in, registering the image and how he was going to make everything align up through sprockets. And Steve had actually sent me some film that was a boxing film that was incredibly warped, and it was off, but it was 16mm. And I did a little tutorial for the users group on Facebook about that. But he's also interested in, what to do when the alignment goes so far out that it just starts to screw up your registration, and I want to talk about that as well. So I needed to go back to a film that I'd already made, which was a World's Fair film. Actually, this isn't the clip I want. I want to go in It's a Small World. Where is it? It's a Small World. There we go. So let's go through the fusion, and I'm going to show you the registration that I had for this, well, I'm not sure if registration is the right word, tracking for this. Okay, and you can see this has already been steadied, and the film is moving around. I actually had to cut this clip of It's a Small World out from the greater body of this. This is the film that I actually did was 3 rolls of Kodachrome, and I did them as an individual roll. So I didn't actually, no, I spliced it together on a 400-foot reel, and I did 150-foot in 2 lots. I had 2 separate files. So I mean, I didn't do it piecemeal. I did massive, a big long section of film. So when you actually look at my timeline here, you can see it's cut up, though. It's not actually as just two separate files. It's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and another little bit at the end. And the reason is because you don't always do your registration or your tracking and your correction on the entire film at once. You can, sometimes it works, but for the most part, you're going to get things drifting off. And if you look at this, it's a small world footage. At the end, you can see the sprocket holes get blown out, and it was at this point where the frame moved too far. And I wanted to deal with this, this small section of film separately. And I think that was Steve's question. Steve was wanting to do a big, long section of film. And so what Steve was having is he's having maybe the registration be out because, if you look at... Yeah, there it is. Let's move along. It mustn't have saved the information. Okay, you can see how this moves, and it moves to correct the film. Okay. This, if you have a blown out hole or the frame moves too far or something, can move dramatically. If it does, you're better off coming in and wherever that point of movement is too much, cut your frame. Then cut your frame and deal with each section separately. Another trick is if you get to the end, particularly when you get to the end of, I'm going to show you on another clip now. I'll show you the end. Yeah, this one here. This is actually a part of the same shot, and if you look, it actually gets the point, and it starts. This is all nice and clean and clear, but if you actually look at the next section of film, this is actually the tail end of the reel. The hole started to get blown out. So I actually had to come in and clip this from the other set of film and deal with it separately. And there's another trick. Okay, you notice that registration stops right there. It's a bit laggy. That is the very last registration point. Well, the next one is the very last registration point on the film. This section here isn't registered. And the reason is because when it was trying to register, areas like this, I mean, you can't do anything about this. When it gets to the end of the film, you often have these, funky movements, and there's nothing you can do about it. So what was happening is if I was trying to register it on these sprocket holes, it would screw up my entire registration. So all you do is you go in, and if you look at the track and the registering, there are several buttons along here, and one of them is called Trim to the End Tracking. Trim to the End deletes tracking data after the current time, and this is before the current time. So what I did was I just removed all these tracking points. And you can do it at the beginning as well, either side of the film. If you find that it's getting to the tail end of your tracking and it's screwing up your entire track, just remove them. And like I say, this is where you would if you were wanting to track this piece separately, you would cut it, go into your editor window, select it, go back into Fusion, and then deal with it separately. So that's the answer to your question, Steve. You go in and you trim your film and track each little clip separately. It can be enormously time consuming, but it is not nearly as time consuming as, let's say, if you were trying to align every clip individually. Oh, and what do I do after that? I mean, this is another question that wasn't asked, but I'll answer it anyway. So what you could potentially end up with in your series of film is a bunch of film that is tracked differently. So let's say this film might be tracked a little bit to this corner, and maybe this film is tracked a little bit to that corner, and so on and so forth. So one of the reasons that I scan over size of, I scan with the 2K and the large format and try and get as much area as possible is so that I can come back and correct it and then clip it. But the first thing I have to do is actually align up my film. And this is how I do it. I create a little, I'm going to zoom in. Let's go to an area where you can actually see some film. I have several of these for for different types of film and so on and so forth. All right, let's go in. Here we go. This is a nice, this is the Rockefeller, which is a nice little clip. So what I do, this one doesn't line up perfectly, but what I do is I actually go in and I set this frame, or this outline, this wire frame, and I will move my background film. So if I select it on, I can actually move my film and get it to match. I mean, this isn't perfect, and this isn't actually what I did for this, but I have these little wireframes for multiple different film types. I bring them in, I align it, I match it with, let's say, this corner here, and what that allows me the option to do is then when I go to my next clip of film, which is, let's move out a little bit, this one here, I can do the same thing. And what I can do is go in and move my film. Oh, it's laggy. Oh, didn't have the right clip of film selected. Okay, so, and then I can move that as well. And that allows me to go and I've tracked all my my little clips of film. I've made sure that all my sprockets and my film line up perfectly. And then I can go back in the greater body of work, make sure that every one of these individual cut clips of film matches a framework so they all align them between one another. And then I can just export my film. I export the very large 2K, 4 to 3 ratio 2K film, which is 2048 by 1536, and then I can bring this uncompressed exported file back into DaVinci, and I can bring it in as a 1080 file and just move this frame around and have it line up with the beautiful nicely set area of 1080. And I just do a little tweak. I downsize it a little bit and it fits perfectly. That was a little bit disjointed, but I hope that made some sense. If anybody has any questions, you can just leave them in the YouTube video, or if this is in the RetroScan users group, just leave them there, and I'll try and make follow-up videos for anything that I do as far as the process goes, from getting my film from film to computer to finished product. Thanks.